Okay, everybody, we're back with another Ironman. We're in our third week here of our series about being fully committed. I hope you had a great Labor Day weekend. I had a great time. It was refreshing, relaxing, and hopefully you are back and ready to go this week. Look forward to having you at our Ironman live in person. If not, hopefully this kind of is helpful to you as we go through 1 Kings. And we're talking today about Solomon. King Solomon, and he was what we would call partially committed. He started off well, and he faded at the end. And I know a lot of people are like that. A lot of men are like that. We have good intentions. We do well for a long time, and then something causes us to slide in our walk, and we get away from God. And then we're not fully committed at that point. We've gotten off track, and that's what we're going to talk about with Solomon's story today. So Solomon was the third king of Israel. First Saul, then David, then Solomon. But why are we talking about stuff that happened in the Old Testament? Shouldn't we be focusing on, things that happened with Jesus and his life and that sort of thing? But there are lessons that we can learn from the Old Testament. If you have not had a chance to go through some of these stories in the Old Testament recently, I really want to encourage you. There's so many lessons. There's so many things to go through and underline that are practical for us today. 2 Timothy 3:16 puts it like this: all scripture is God-breathed and profitable for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. So there are things that we can get from any part of Scripture that can help us out. So we jump into the story, and David is an old man, and he is about to die, and he goes ahead and he has told he's told his son Solomon that he's going to be the next king. Well, in the meantime, one of David's other sons, named Adonai, decides he's going to be the king, and he throws a big party with all of his people, and they have this little coronation thing with all the other people in his group, all of his friends, all of his supporters. They've all gathered together to name him king. Well, Nathan, and if you'll remember Nathan, he was a prophet. He was the same one who came to David with the bad news about Bathsheba and the sin that he had committed and all that. Well, now Nathan is tasked with some more bad news, right, as David is on his deathbed, saying, hey, I hate to tell you this, but one of your other sons, Adonai, has now declared himself king. Well, David, even on his deathbed, throws together a plan. He says, hey, get a priest and we're going to go announce that Solomon is king. So lots of people gathered around, and they had a coronation for Solomon now being the king. So you got two different parties kind of going on that are both declaring themselves king. Well, Adonai knew the truth. He knew that Solomon was the rightful successor to being the king, and he sort of runs for his life, runs for protection in the temple. And King Solomon says, he says, if he shows himself worthy, not a hair on his head will fall to the ground, but if evil is found in him, he will die. So Solomon makes a very gracious decision about his brother Adonai. Look, I'll give him a chance. If he proves that he's loyal, we'll let him live. Well, if you guys know the story, Adonai did not prove himself loyal, and King Solomon killed him and all of the people that were involved in the coup. So this is what's going on at the beginning of Solomon's story. But it gets better from there for him. There's no war going on. There's peace in the region, and he can just focus on leading Jerusalem. So there was no wars going on or anything. There was peace and prosperity in the land. God comes to Solomon and says, I'll give you anything you want. So Solomon answers God very wisely, and he asks for wisdom. Okay, so if we are a fully committed follower of Christ, we need to learn to ask the right things of him. We need to ask for wisdom. We need to ask for advice on how to do life. We need to ask God on a variety of things that would be helpful for him and his kingdom purposes here. So 1 Kings 3:6, it says this, it's on your screen. It says, you have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on the throne this very day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. You give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern the great people of this land? Okay, Solomon recognized his limitations, and we as men need to recognize our limitations too. That we need to go to God and say, look, this is too hard for me. This temptation is too much for me. Whatever it is, we need to be able to come to God and say, God, I need wisdom in getting through this. Now, there's a difference between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge is like being book smart. Wisdom is learning how to do life with, and to have the skill to do that. Recently here at the Grove, we had a 80s trivia night. Well, my team won, and I was surprised at how many questions from the 80s that I actually knew. Not useful at all, but just knowledge that I had picked up along the way. I was in high school and junior high and college all during the 80s, which is a time when we pay attention to those kind of things, music and movies and all the pop culture type stuff. So I knew all of that, but it wasn't wisdom. It wasn't something I could apply to my life. It was just knowledge. So we need wisdom. And the ability, so that we can have the ability to handle life with skill. Let me repeat that. We need wisdom so that we can have the ability to handle life skillfully. We all need to know how to do life correctly, and that's where wisdom comes in. We all yearn for practical wisdom to help us know what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to go about doing it. But oftentimes when we want wisdom, where do we go? We think we're going for wisdom, but we're actually going to the internet or we're going to people for advice. And sometimes God's way down on the list when it comes to asking for the right thing to do or for the right way to go about things. James 3:15 says this, such wisdom does not come from heaven, but is earthly, it's unspiritual, and it's of the devil. James is saying that worldly wisdom is a wisdom that actually ignores God and it doesn't seek God. Billy Graham once said this, he said, knowledge is horizontal and wisdom is vertical. It comes down from above. So if you want real wisdom, we have to humble ourselves and admit to God that we need his help and we need his guidance. 1 Corinthians 1:25 says this, the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than man's strength. God has already obviously forgotten more than we will ever know in life. Solomon was wise enough to see that he needed help leading Israel. If any of you guys ever been in a job before where, maybe you lied on your resume or you got hired for a position that you knew was too big for you. You felt these limitations that you had, but God still gave you this opportunity. Well, now that you're in this opportunity and now that we get this type of position, we need to ask God for help. 1 Kings 3, starting in verse 11, says, since you have asked for this is God speaking to Solomon, since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment and administrating justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise, discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that in your lifetime will you have no equal among kings. And if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands of David your father, I will give you a long life. So not only did God grant Solomon his request, as God often does for us, he goes over and above. He gives him an abundance. He really blessed him with honor and riches and wealth. So we see Solomon starting to do things that are wise, and he writes in the book of Proverbs different wise things that people should know about. For instance, he said in Proverbs, speaking of evil, he says, do not be wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones. That's from Psalm 3, 7, and 8. When he talks about money, he says, honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of your crops, and your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. That comes from Proverbs 3, 9, and 10. He's got so much wise, practical wisdom for us. The plans of the diligent, he says, lead to profit, as surely as haste leads towards poverty. Then when he talks about the tongue, he says this, he says, a gossipy person betrays a confidence. So avoid anyone who talks too much. See, Solomon gives us very practical things. We need to ask God for this kind of wisdom so that we can go through life skillfully. So according to the Bible, Solomon was also given fame and he was given great wealth. And a lot of this wealth he used for good things. It says according to the Bible, he accumulated 25 tons of gold. Well, 25 tons of gold today is hundreds of millions of dollars. And that was just part of his portfolio. He also had ships. He had a whole shipping industry that was bringing back spices and all kinds of things that they were selling and making money on. He was getting tributes from other countries around that wanted to be on Israel's good side. So he was worth probably billions of dollars in today's world. 1 Kings 10:23-26 sums it up like this. It says, King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings on the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. Year after year, everyone who came brought gifts, articles of silver and gold and robes, weapons and spices, and horses and mules. So the whole world, it says, is bringing tribute to Solomon. So Solomon, you could say, had everything going for him. Maybe some of you guys have a lot of things going for you. Maybe life is really good right now, and you think, when you read this, you go, why in the world would Solomon do what he's about to do? Queen of Sheba came, wanted an audience with him, dignitaries from all over the world. And Solomon had this wealth and fame, and with that came the opportunity to show the people that it was God behind all of this, to point people towards God through all these great things. Things were going well, but then disaster struck. Then the crash came. And we read this. It says he stopped applying this wisdom to his own life. It's one thing to know about it and to teach about it, but it's another thing to apply it to your own life. James 3:13 says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by his deeds and humility that comes from wisdom. You see, if we're going to have wisdom, we show it by the way that we live. We don't just talk to people about it. We don't tell them about it. We actually have to let people witness it in our own lives. So here we go. King Solomon loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must never intermarry them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth, and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. And Solomon grew old. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord, as the heart of David his father had been. He allowed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord. But Solomon had been warned. If you go back and you look at Deuteronomy 17:16, where God said that a king, and this is the quote, says, must not take many wives or his heart will be led astray. God knew this was going to happen. Okay, he gave advice through the law at the time. And we don't just see Solomon getting a few wives. You know, he way outpaced everybody. He went above what David had many wives too. You know, that's not what God's intention was for him either. But 700 wives and 300 concubines. I can't even get my head around that. 700 wives. You think about it, if he did it all in a row, he had a different wedding ceremony every day for 2 years. Every single day in a row, he had a wedding. Not to mention 300 like mistresses or concubines. How in the world, how do you keep up with that? Like, you know, I have one wife right now. That's plenty. That's all I need. But 700? I mean, what was the point of all that? He just had a real weakness for women. So how did this happen? How did Solomon turn from worshiping the one true God to worshiping all these false gods? And I can tell you this, it didn't happen overnight. Okay, this happened slowly, gradually. His first wife was Pharaoh's daughter. Okay, probably not a follower of God, as the Egyptians weren't at that time. So he takes multiple wives. This is his first mistake. And to make matters worse, he starts marrying women from other nations. And this isn't really a racial thing or ethnicity thing. This is an idolatry issue, because the women in these other countries didn't worship Yahweh. They didn't worship God. They didn't share Solomon's faith. They worshiped false gods. For example, the Moabites required child sacrifices. So there's a very good, reason to believe that Solomon probably sacrificed some of his children to this god of the Moabites. Some of these gods that they talked about had temple prostitutes. Just horrible things that it's hard to imagine that a king who had a previous relationship with God, where he was his only God, he knew what his dad believed, but he got so far away from it at the end. So it was gradual, almost imperceptible, one wife at a time, one trip to a foreign god's temple at a time. And it happened slowly until he found himself really in this pile of rubble. I think about today, how can we relate to this? Because we're not going to have 700 wives. We're not going to have 300 concubines, but there might be someone who falls into adultery. Those things happen. There might be a situation where you smoke, let's just say marijuana. It's fine. It's legal, right? But is it wise? Is it going to make you a better person? It's a gateway drug, as they call it. So it could be just, you start off slow and, eventually after that you decide you need a little bit more to get you high, and then it leads into some hardcore drugs. And before you know it, you're in rehabilitation. Okay, so single guys, this part of the message is for you, okay? And if you're dating someone right now that you don't share the same faith with in Jesus, it's a very dangerous thing to do. And I say that, and I almost feel like a hypocrite saying that, because before I got married, I did the same thing. I dated women who were not Christian, that didn't share the same values I did. I remember bringing a girl home one time I think my mom invited us to come over and have dinner with them. And afterwards she says, I get the feeling that girl's not a Christian. Is she a Christian? I said, no, I don't think so. They said, then what are you doing dating her? I'm like, well, I don't know, just having fun. I'm not planning on marrying her. They're like, well, why are you dating somebody you're not planning on marrying? I remember this was back in the early 90s, and we felt like our parents were old-fashioned then, but now, the advice was probably pretty solid, and one that I would give my kids as well. The Bible tells us not to be unequally yoked. And we think of that automatically as marriage, but think about it as dating too. Being unequally yoked, the yoke part was, when they had two oxen that they had put these yokes on and they were plowing, and if you had one that was stronger than the other or that wasn't equally matched, you were all over the place. Okay, you weren't getting the job done like you should. We need to be equal in our faith and our thoughts and what we believe in God. Stop there for a second. I just squeaked. That's all right. We'll carry. I don't care if it has a sound like that. That's fine. Okay. The problem with being unequally yoked is you don't relate to issues the same way. You're not kind of living by the same instructions or the same blueprint. Let's say something comes up with your kids. Are we going to raise them in the church? Are we not going to raise them in the church? Can you sit and pray for your wife or pray with your wife if she doesn't believe the same kind of things that you believe? It's really difficult to do that. And, fortunately, my wife and I, we share the same values. We share the same faith. We met on the mission field together in Africa. So we have a lot of those kind of things in common going into our marriage. But God designed marriage, to function as one man and one woman committed for life in sort of this oneness that can't happen with multiple wives. And I know that polygamy is not really a thing so much with Christians. I know that it still does happen sometimes in other religions in the world. So that's not really something that we're dealing with much. But let me ask you this. What is something that we deal with right now that God has probably a difficult time with? and the way that things are going with this. I want to bring this up to you. It's called cohabitation. It's living with somebody before you get married. And I hate to say this, I'm going to probably step on some toes and maybe even scare a few people off, but this is against what God teaches us, and it's against God's law, and it's called fornication. And it's living together before marriage. Okay, this is something that's changed so much in my lifetime. And I just read the statistics on this, that since 1971, okay, so let's just basically say during my lifetime, the number of people that live together outside of marriage has increased 700%, okay, in the last 50 years. Now it's no big deal to hear people that are living together. I don't even think twice about it. Somebody talked to me about it the other day, and even myself as a pastor, I was like, that's just kind of how it is these days. Okay, not wanting to judge them or anything, but are we teaching them that it's probably not God's best? They say that people that are married now, in 10 years' time, 15 out of 100 will still be married. Let me repeat that. Make sure I got that right. In 10 years' time, if you're living together right now, 15 out of 100 will be married. Okay, but we have people that live together say, yeah, we're going to get married. We'll get there. But the chances of you lasting to the 10-year point are very, very unreasonable, and it's probably not going to happen. Also, the divorce rate with people who lived together before they got married is 7 out of 10. Whereas people that, I know this is a terrible statistic, but it's a little bit better. The normal divorce rate in America is like somewhere in the 40 percentile. Okay, so you do increase your chance of divorce by living together ahead of time. Plus, it's not God's best for us. It's not God's best for you. Okay, so Christian men out there, you are married. Okay, the problem is with us is we oftentimes don't model what a good Christian marriage looks like when it's done God's way. Okay, are we sharing with other people who are just married or people who are about to get married? Are we modeling a marriage that we should be? So Christian husbands and wives, we need to apply God's wisdom to our marriage so that people will be drawn to that, to what we have. Anytime we yield to sin, and I want to just finish with this, and I started thinking about Solomon and his life. When you yield to sin, okay, it doesn't just happen overnight. Okay, it's a little bit here and there. No one wakes up in the morning, one morning, and says, you know what, I'm going to turn myself into an alcoholic. Okay, I think this morning I'm going to have an affair, maybe later today, and just go ahead and just wreck my whole family life because of that. Nobody wakes up and does that. It's a little bit at a time. It's a little bit at a time. And when we yield to this sin, it always leaves us wanting. Okay, in Ecclesiastes, Solomon at the end of his life says everything is meaningless. Okay, he had all the wealth, all the knowledge, all the wisdom in the world, and he says it's all meaningless. Okay, he's tried everything. He yielded to sin and described it as meaningless. So yielding to sin always leaves us empty, men. Okay, let's be wise about this. If we're going to be fully committed, let's be all in with God, and let's be full of the fruits of the Spirit. Let's be full of the joy that comes with that. When we yield to sin, okay, we feel empty. Let's learn to be like Solomon, okay? Let's learn the good and let's learn the bad, okay? Let's learn to ask God for the right things, and let's be very careful that we're not slowly allowing sin to creep into our life, and before we know it, our life is in a pile of rubble like it was when Solomon died. You guys, I hope this is encouraging to you this week, and we'll see you next week.